When a convoy of 40 soldiers was trapped in a collapsing underground bunker with oxygen running out, every experienced pilot stood grounded by the impossible conditions. But the one person who could fly the rescue mission was the helicopter mechanic. They'd all called Benchwarmer Betty for the past 4 years. The desert heat at Firebase Scorpion was merciless, but it wasn't the sun that made Captain Rebecca Betty Martinez feel invisible. At 28, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches in her combat boots. Her dark hair always pulled back in the regulation bun that made her round face look even younger than her years. While other soldiers moved with the confident swagger of warriors, Betty walked with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to stay out of the way. Her official designation was Helicopter Maintenance Specialist, which sounded important until you realized it meant she was the one crawling under aircraft, while real pilots flew missions that mattered. The nickname had started during her first week at the base when she'd spent an entire day sitting on a bench outside the hangar, waiting for permission to work on a grounded Black Hawk. Sergeant Major Tom Rodriguez had walked by and muttered, "Look at Benchwarmer Betty over there, waiting for someone to put her in the game." The name stuck like desert sand in your boots. 4 years later, every soldier on the base knew her as Benchwarmer Betty, the mechanic who fixed their rides but never got to drive them. They said it without malice, mostly just the casual dismissal that came with military hierarchy. Pilots flew. Mechanics fixed. Betty was definitely a mechanic. She'd grown up in a family of Air Force veterans in San Antonio, where her father had run a small aircraft repair shop and her 3 older brothers had all become pilots. Betty had always been the one handing them tools and learning how engines worked while they dreamed of the sky. When she'd enlisted, everyone assumed she'd follow the family tradition and become a pilot. Instead, she'd scored highest in mechanical aptitude and been assigned to maintenance. Her brothers had tried to hide their disappointment during her graduation from technical school. "Maintenance is important too," her oldest brother Miguel had sighed, but she caught the look he exchanged with their father. In a family of pilots, being the mechanic felt like being the equipment manager on a championship football team. Necessary, but not exactly what anyone wrote songs about. At Firebase Scorpion, that dynamic played out every single day. The base was home to the 47th Helicopter Squadron, an elite unit that conducted reconnaissance and rescue operations across 3 countries. The pilots were the heroes, their names on mission reports and commendation letters. Betty's name appeared on maintenance logs and equipment inventories, documents that nobody read unless something broke. The hangar where she worked was a cathedral of mechanical precision. 6 Black Hawks and 2 Chinook heavy-lift helicopters, set in perfect rows, their rotors folded back like sleeping birds. Betty knew every bolt, every wire, every system in each aircraft better than most people knew their own cars. She could diagnose engine problems by sound, identify hydraulic leaks by smell, and predict mechanical failures by the subtle vibrations she felt through her hands. But knowing how to fix helicopters wasn't the same as knowing how to fly them, at least according to everyone else on the base. The pilots were friendly enough when they needed her expertise, but she was support staff, not aircrew. When they talked about missions over dinner in the mess hall, Betty ate at a different table with the other mechanics and ground crew. When they celebrated successful operations at the on-base recreation center, Betty usually stayed in her quarters, reading technical manuals or watching movies on her laptop. The separation wasn't hostile, just complete. Pilots lived in one world, mechanics in another, and there wasn't much overlap between them. Betty had learned to accept her place in the hierarchy, even if it sometimes felt like being permanently benched in a game she desperately wanted to play. Her quarters were a small room in the maintenance wing, decorated with family photos and a collection of aviation books that she'd been accumulating since high school. Unlike most soldiers' rooms, which featured posters of sports teams or movie stars, Betty's walls were covered with detailed cutaway diagrams of helicopter systems. and photographs of aircraft she'd worked on over the years. Her roommate had rotated out 6 months earlier, leaving Betty with the rare luxury of privacy in a place where personal space was usually measured in square feet. Late at night, when the base was quiet except for the hum of generators and the distant sound of perimeter guards, Betty would pull out a battered flight simulator program on her personal laptop. She'd discovered the software during technical school and had been secretly practicing for years, teaching herself to fly the same aircraft she maintained during the day. The program was sophisticated enough to include realistic physics and system failures, but Betty told herself it was just curiosity, a way to better understand how the machines she fixed were supposed to perform. She never mentioned the simulator sessions to anyone. What would be the point? She wasn't a pilot, would never be a pilot, and pretending otherwise was just a way to torture herself with possibilities that would never become reality. Besides, everyone knew that video game flying was nothing like the real thing. The pilots made sure to mention that whenever the subject came up, usually when some new recruit bragged about their gaming skills, the daily routine at Firebase Scorpion was as predictable as the sunrise. Betty reported to the hangar at 0600, performed pre-flight inspections on whichever aircraft were scheduled for missions, and spent the day troubleshooting problems that other mechanics couldn't solve. She had a reputation for being able to fix anything, which meant she got the most complex problems and the most impossible deadlines. "Martinez, I need that Black Hawk airworthy in 2 hours," was a phrase she heard at least 3 times a week. And somehow she always managed to deliver. Bent rotor blades, faulty navigation systems, hydraulic leaks that had other mechanics stumped. Betty could diagnose and repair problems that should have required days of work. She developed an intuitive understanding of helicopter systems that went beyond technical training, an ability to feel what was wrong with an aircraft just by listening to its engines. The pilots noticed her skill, but only in the context of getting their birds back in the air. "Betty's magic," they'd say when she fixed something that should have been unfixable. But magic was just another word for something they didn't understand, and not understanding meant not taking it seriously. She was useful, reliable, and completely invisible as anything other than a very good mechanic. Captain James Parker, the squadron's executive officer, had tried to convince Betty to apply for flight training during her 2nd year at the base. He'd seen her work and noticed the aviation books in her room during a routine inspection. "You've got the mechanical knowledge," he'd told her. Flight training would build on that foundation, but Betty had declined. The application process was competitive, the training was grueling, and failure meant being reassigned to a different base, probably doing maintenance on cargo planes instead of combat helicopters. Besides, she was good at her current job, respected for her technical skills, and relatively happy with her role on the team. Why risk losing what she had for something that might not work out? That conversation had been 2 years ago, and Captain Parker had never brought it up again. Betty sometimes wondered what would have happened if she'd taken his advice, but those thoughts usually came late at night when the base was quiet and she was alone with her flight simulator, practicing maneuvers she'd never perform in real life. The other mechanics respected her expertise, but didn't really understand it. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, Tom's younger brother who joined the unit a year after Betty, was competent with routine maintenance, but called her whenever he encountered anything unusual. "Betty's got the magic touch," he'd say, echoing the pilot's casual dismissal of her abilities as something mysterious rather than learned. She'd tried to teach him some of her diagnostic techniques, but Mike preferred following checklists to developing intuition. "Just tell me what to fix," he'd say when she attempted to explain how she could tell the difference between a failing hydraulic pump and a loose connection just by the sound. Most people wanted solutions, not understanding, and Betty had learned to provide what they needed rather than what she thought they should know. The isolation wasn't entirely unwelcome. Betty had always been more comfortable with machines than people, more interested in understanding how things worked than in playing social games. The hangar was her domain, a place where problems had solutions and effort produced results. She could spend hours troubleshooting a complex system, failure, and feel genuinely satisfied when she finally identified the root cause. But sometimes, watching the helicopters lift off for missions while she stayed behind to clean up the tools, Betty felt like she was living half a life. She knew these aircraft better than anyone, understood their capabilities and limitations with an intimacy that came from countless hours of intimate contact with their systems. Yet she was permanently grounded, forever watching others live the adventures she could only experience through a computer screen. The morning routine never varied. Betty would arrive at the hangar before dawn, start the coffee pot that kept the maintenance crew functional, and begin the pre-flight inspections that ensured the aircraft were safe for the safe day's operations. She moved through each check with methodical precision, testing systems and examining components with the thoroughness that had made her indispensable to the squadron's operations. Other mechanics performed inspections by following checklists, marking off items as they completed each step. Betty performed inspections by listening to the aircraft, feeling for vibrations that shouldn't be there, noticing subtle changes in how systems responded to her inputs. She could detect problems that wouldn't show up on diagnostic equipment for weeks, preventing failures that could have been catastrophic. This morning would start like every other morning for the past 4 years. Betty would check the aircraft. The pilots would fly the missions, and she would spend another day being useful but invisible. Benchwarmer Betty, sitting on the sidelines while others played the game she knew better than any of them realized. But this morning would also be the last time anyone called her a benchwarmer, though none of them knew it yet. In 6 hours, 40 soldiers would be trapped underground with their oxygen running out, and every qualified pilot on the base would be grounded by conditions that made flying impossible. That's when everyone would discover that sometimes the most overlooked person on the team is exactly the person you need when everything goes wrong. The flight simulator on Betty's laptop wasn't much to look at. A 15-inch screen displaying basic instrument panels and a simplified cockpit view. That would have made real pilots laugh. But what it lacked in visual sophistication, it made up for in accuracy. The physics engine was built on actual helicopter flight dynamics, and the system failures were programmed by engineers who understood how aircraft actually broke down in combat conditions. Betty had discovered the software during her second month at Firebase Scorpion, buried in a folder of technical training materials that someone had left on a shared computer in the maintenance office. Most of her colleagues had ignored it, assuming it was just another boring educational program. But Betty had recognized it immediately as something much more valuable, a way to understand how the helicopters she fixed were supposed to behave when everything was working correctly. Her first attempts at virtual flying had been disasters. The simulated Black Hawk had crashed spectacularly within minutes of takeoff, spinning out of control as she overcorrected for movements she didn't understand. But Betty approached the simulator the same way she approached mechanical problems, with patient persistence and careful attention to detail. She studied the flight characteristics, analyzed what went wrong after each crash, and gradually began to understand the relationship between pilot inputs and aircraft response. 3 months into her secret flying lessons, Betty had progressed from barely maintaining level flight to executing basic maneuvers with something approaching competence. 6 months in, she was attempting emergency procedures and auto-rotation landings. By her first anniversary at the base, she could fly complex missions that would have challenged some of the squadron's newer pilots. The laptop lived on a small desk in her quarters, positioned so that anyone walking past her open door would see her working on what appeared to be maintenance documentation. Betty had learned to alt-tab between the flight simulator and technical manuals whenever she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her secret remained safe because nobody expected a mechanic to be interested in piloting, and nobody looked closely enough. at her screen to see what she was actually doing. Late-night flying sessions became Betty's escape from the daily reality of being perpetually overlooked. In the virtual cockpit, she wasn't Benchwarmer Betty waiting for someone to give her a chance. She was the pilot making split-second decisions, executing complex maneuvers, and bringing damaged aircraft home safely. The simulation gave her a taste of the life she might have lived if she'd been born into a different body or a different family's expectations. The software included hundreds of pre-programmed scenarios, from basic training exercises to complex combat rescue missions. Betty worked through them systematically, starting with simple patterns and gradually progressing to situations that pushed both her skills and the aircraft's capabilities. She learned to fly in thunderstorms, navigate through mountain valleys, and execute precision landings on moving ships and improvised landing zones. Emergency procedures became her specialty. The simulator could throw multiple system failures at once: engine fires, hydraulic failures, electrical problems, and rotor damage, all happening simultaneously while the aircraft fought to stay airborne. Betty practiced these scenarios obsessively, learning to prioritize critical systems and manage cascading failures with the kind of calm focus that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. She memorized emergency checklists for situations that most pilots hoped they'd never encounter. Complete electrical failure at night over hostile territory, auto-rotation landings with damaged tail rotors, navigation system failures during low-visibility approaches. Each scenario taught her something new about aircraft behavior and decision-making. Under pressure, knowledge that she stored away without any expectation that she'd ever use it. The maintenance hangar gave Betty access to information that most pilots never saw: detailed failure reports, maintenance logs, and engineering analyses of why aircraft systems broke down under stress. She combined this mechanical knowledge with her virtual flying experience, developing an understanding of helicopter capabilities that was both theoretical and practical. She knew not just how to fly these machines, but how they failed and why. Real pilots learned through flight hours and instructor feedback. Betty learned through systematic analysis and repetitive practice, approaching flying the same way she approached mechanical troubleshooting. She identified problems, developed solutions, and tested them until they became automatic responses. Her virtual logbook eventually recorded more flight time than some of the squadron's junior pilots had accumulated in actual aircraft. The squadron's pilots occasionally mentioned their own simulator training, which took place at a facility 3 hours away and involved expensive full-motion platforms with wraparound visual systems. They complained about the artificial feel of simulated flying and insisted that nothing could replace actual stick time in real aircraft. Betty listened to these conversations while working on their helicopters, saying nothing about her own thousands of hours in virtual cockpits. She'd learned to keep her aviation knowledge carefully hidden during routine interactions with the flight crews. When pilots discussed mission planning or aircraft performance, Betty limited her comments to mechanical issues. She knew better than to offer opinions about flight techniques or tactical decisions, even when she could see obvious improvements that might have enhanced safety or mission effectiveness. Mechanics who tried to act like pilots were quickly reminded of their place in the hierarchy, but the knowledge accumulated anyway, stored in Betty's mind like a vast library of aviation expertise that nobody knew existed. She understood weather patterns that affected helicopter operations, navigation techniques for low-visibility flights, and tactical considerations for combat rescue missions. Her virtual experience had taught her to think like a pilot, while her mechanical training helped her understand aircraft systems at a level that most aviators never achieved. The simulator scenarios included detailed recreations of actual rescue missions, many of them based on operations that had taken place in the same region where Firebase Scorpion was located. Betty had virtually flown dozens of combat rescues, medical evacuations, and special operations insertions. She'd practiced flying at night through mountain valleys, landing in hot zones under enemy fire, and extracting personnel from locations that barely qualified as landing zones. One scenario had particularly captured her attention, a mission involving the extraction of trapped personnel from an underground facility. The virtual environment simulated the kind of precision flying required to lower rescue equipment through narrow openings, while maintaining stable hover positions and challenging wind conditions. Betty had practiced the scenario until she could execute it perfectly, though she'd never imagined she might someday face a similar situation in real life. Her mechanical duties provided unexpected opportunities to enhance her flying knowledge. When aircraft returned from missions with unusual wear patterns or minor damage, Betty would analyze the evidence and try to reconstruct what had happened during the flight. Stress patterns on rotor blades could tell her about aggressive maneuvering. Hydraulic system wear indicated how hard the aircraft had been pushed. Engine analysis revealed flight profiles and power settings used during operations. She developed a mental database of how different pilots flew, recognizing their techniques through the mechanical evidence left behind after each mission. Captain Rodriguez was aggressive with power applications, often pushing engines harder than necessary. Lieutenant Morrison had a tendency to over-control during hover operations, creating unnecessary stress on flight. Control systems. Major Williams was smooth and efficient, rarely leaving any evidence of hard flying in the aircraft he operated. This forensic approach to understanding pilot technique taught Betty lessons that no simulator could provide. She learned to recognize the difference between confident flying and reckless flying, between necessary risks and poor judgment. The aircraft themselves became textbooks that taught her about human factors in aviation, showing her how personality and experience translated into flying technique. Technical manuals provided another layer of education that Betty absorbed during her off-duty hours. She read engineering specifications, performance charts, and operational limitations with the same intensity that other soldiers brought to entertainment or socializing. Her quarters were filled with maintenance publications, pilot operating handbooks, and technical orders that most mechanics would only consult when troubleshooting specific problems. The combination of virtual flying experience, mechanical knowledge, and theoretical study gave Betty an understanding of helicopter operations that was unique among the personnel at Firebase Scorpion. She knew these aircraft from perspectives that neither pure pilots nor pure mechanics possessed. She understood the engineering compromises that affected performance, the maintenance requirements that limited operational tempo, and the human factors that influenced mission success. Her secret education had taken 4 years to complete, conducted entirely during off-duty hours when the rest of the base was sleeping, socializing, or relaxing. Betty had invested thousands of hours in learning skills that she had no official reason to possess and no obvious opportunity to use. She told herself it was just intellectual curiosity, a way to better understand the machines she maintained and the missions they supported. But late at night, when she was flying virtual rescue missions through simulated combat zones, Betty sometimes allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to be the pilot that everyone counted on when situations became impossible. In those moments, she wasn't Benchwarmer Betty, the mechanic. She was the aviator she'd trained herself to become, ready for challenges that would test everything she'd learned about flying, fixing, and staying calm when lives depended on making the right decisions under pressure. The opportunity to prove herself would come sooner than she expected, though Betty had no way of knowing that her secret preparation was about to become the most important qualification anyone on the base possessed. Tomorrow, 40 soldiers would need a pilot capable of flying a rescue mission that every qualified aviator would declare impossible. And the only person ready for that challenge would be the mechanic they'd all dismissed as someone who belonged permanently on the bench. The maintenance alarm that shattered the pre-dawn quiet at Firebase Scorpion wasn't unusual. Aircraft broke down regularly in the harsh desert environment, and emergency repairs were part of Betty's routine. What made this morning different was the voice on the radio, tight with barely controlled panic, calling for immediate assistance with a Black Hawk that had developed severe vibrations during a routine patrol. Betty was already moving toward the hangar when she heard Captain Rodriguez's voice crackling through the communications system. Firebase Scorpion, this is Eagle 1. We've got major rotor vibrations and loss of tail rotor authority. Requesting immediate emergency landing assistance and maintenance support. The aircraft limped into the landing zone with an asymmetric rotor pattern that made Betty's stomach clench. She'd seen this type of damage before. A loose Jesus nut, the single bolt that held the entire rotor system together. If it failed completely, the helicopter would disintegrate in flight, taking its crew with it. Captain Rodriguez had managed to nurse the aircraft home through pure pilot skill and considerable luck. Betty was waiting with her tools when the engines wound down and the crew climbed out on shaking legs. Rodriguez looked pale despite his tan, the kind of complexion that came from staring death in the face and realizing how close you'd come to not walking away. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Sarah Chun, was actually trembling as she performed the post-flight inspection. "How bad is it, Martinez?" Rodriguez asked, his usual commanding tone replaced by something that sounded almost vulnerable. Betty was already underneath the aircraft, flashlight in hand, examining the rotor hub assembly with the systematic thoroughness that had made her indispensable to the squadron's operations. The damage was worse than she'd expected. The Jesus nut was loose enough that she could turn it with her fingers, and stress fractures were visible in 2 of the rotor blade attachment points. This aircraft should have come apart in flight, and the fact that it hadn't was either a miracle or a testament to Rodriguez's ability to feel problems through the flight controls before they became catastrophic. "You're grounded until I can replace the entire rotor hub assembly," Betty told him, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came with being the person who understood these machines better than anyone else on the base. "This bird shouldn't have made it back in one piece." "How long were you feeling the vibrations?" Rodriguez looked uncomfortable with the question, and Betty could read the answer in his expression before he spoke. He'd felt the problem developing, but had pushed the aircraft beyond safe limits to complete his mission, gambling that the helicopter would hold together long enough to get his crew home. It was the kind of calculated risk that separated military pilots from civilian aviators, but it was also the kind of decision that could have killed everyone aboard. "About 20 minutes, he admitted. "Started as a minor buzz, then got progressively worse during the return flight. I should have landed immediately, but we were over hostile territory with no secure landing zones." Betty nodded, understanding the impossible choices that combat pilots faced every day. She'd read enough incident reports to know that the decision to continue flying with mechanical problems was often the difference between completing a mission and becoming a statistic. Rodriguez had made the right call under the circumstances, but it had been a close thing. The repair work required precision and patience, qualities that Betty possessed in abundance. She spent the next 4 hours disassembling the rotor system, examining each component for damage, and rebuilding the assembly with new parts that she'd requisitioned from the base supply depot. Other mechanics would have needed a full day to complete the same work, but Betty had developed an efficiency that came from understanding exactly how these systems were supposed to function. Captain Parker, the executive officer, stopped by during the repair process to check on the aircraft's status. He found Betty suspended underneath the Black Hawk, her small frame allowing her to access components that would have required removing additional systems for larger mechanics to reach. Hands moved with surgical precision as she torqued bolts to exact specifications, each movement economical and purposeful. "How's she looking, Martinez?" Parker asked, crouching down to see what she was doing. Betty's head appeared from behind a hydraulic line, her face streaked with grease, but her expression confident. "She'll be better than new when I'm finished," Betty replied, her voice carrying the quiet certainty that came from complete mastery of her craft. "I'm replacing some components that were showing early wear patterns. This bird will be the most reliable aircraft in the squadron when I sign off on the maintenance log." Parker had learned to trust Betty's assessments completely. In 2 years of working together, she'd never been wrong about an aircraft's condition or the time required to complete repairs. Her mechanical intuition was so reliable that he'd stopped questioning her diagnoses, even when they contradicted what other mechanics or diagnostic equipment suggested. "Rodriguez says you saved his crew," Parker observed, watching her work with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was seeing something significant. "He thinks the rotor system would have failed completely if you hadn't caught the problem during your inspection." Betty paused in her work, considering the comment carefully. She hadn't performed any special inspection, just her normal routine of listening to the aircraft and feeling for problems that might not show up on standard checklists. But Parker was right that she'd identified the developing failure before it became catastrophic. "I just know what these birds are supposed to sound like," she said finally, returning to her work. "When something changes, I notice it. Most problems give you warning signs if you know how to read them." What she didn't mention was that her virtual flying experience had taught her to recognize the pilot inputs that typically preceded mechanical failures. Rodriguez's aggressive flying style put additional stress on rotor systems, and Betty had been watching for signs of premature wear in aircraft that he flew regularly. Her mechanical knowledge combined with her understanding of pilot technique had allowed her to predict this failure before it happened. Parker stayed to watch her complete the repair, noting the way she worked without referring to technical manuals or consulting with other mechanics. Betty approached each task with the confidence of someone who had performed the same procedures hundreds of times, though he knew that this particular repair was complex enough that most mechanics would have needed supervision and reference materials. "Have you ever thought about cross-training into other specialties?" Parker asked as Betty began the final inspection of her work. "Your mechanical knowledge is impressive, but I think you might have aptitude for other aspects of aviation operations." The suggestion caught Betty off guard, though she tried not to show it. Cross-training opportunities were rare and usually reserved for personnel who had demonstrated exceptional performance in their primary specialties. The fact that Parker was even mentioning it suggested that her work had been noticed at levels above her immediate supervisors. "I'm happy with maintenance, sir," she replied, testing the rotor hub assembly for proper torque and movement. "I like working with my hands and solving problems. Flying is for other people." But even as she said it, Betty felt the weight of her secret simulator training pressing against her consciousness. She was probably better qualified to fly this aircraft than half the pilots in the squadron, but admitting that would require explaining how she'd acquired those skills. The conversation was moving into dangerous territory where her hidden expertise might become visible. Parker seemed to sense her discomfort and changed the subject back to the mechanical repair. But Betty could feel his attention in a way that was different from the casual acknowledgement she usually received for her work. He was looking at her, as if seeing something he hadn't noticed before, evaluating her potential rather than just her current performance. The test flight that afternoon was routine for everyone except Betty, who watched from the hangar as Rodriguez and Chun took the repaired Black Hawk through a comprehensive check of all systems. She'd done perfect work, as always, but seeing the aircraft perform flawlessly gave her a satisfaction that went beyond professional pride. Every smooth maneuver and stable hover confirmed her understanding of how these machines were supposed to behave when everything was working correctly. Rodriguez found her after the flight, his earlier tension replaced by the relaxed confidence of a pilot whose aircraft was performing exactly as designed. His handshake was firmer than usual, and his expression carried a respect that hadn't been there that morning. "That bird flies like she just rolled off the assembly line," he told her, his voice carrying genuine gratitude. "I don't know how you do it, Martinez, but you've got some kind of magic with these machines. Chung says the flight controls feel better than they have in months." Betty accepted the compliment with her usual quiet acknowledgement, but internally she was analyzing Rodriguez's description of the aircraft's performance. The improved control feel was the result of replacing worn bushings in the flight control linkages, components that most mechanics wouldn't have identified as needing replacement. Her ability to detect subtle degradation in aircraft systems was becoming legendary among the flight crews. "Just doing my job, Captain," she replied, already turning her attention to the next aircraft on her maintenance schedule. But Rodriguez wasn't finished with the conversation. "I mean it, Martinez. You understand these birds better than most pilots understand flying. If you ever decide you want to do something besides maintenance, you'd have my recommendation for whatever program you wanted to apply for." The offer was generous and genuine, but it also highlighted the fundamental assumption that everyone made about Betty's capabilities and interests. They saw her mechanical expertise and imagined her transitioning into other technical specialties, avionics, perhaps, or flight engineering. Nobody considered that she might want to be the person sitting in the pilot's seat, making the decisions that her mechanical work supported. That evening, Betty returned to her quarters and opened her flight simulator with a sense of anticipation that had been building throughout the day. The morning's emergency had reminded her why she'd started learning to fly in the first place. Not just intellectual curiosity, but a deep desire to be the person who could handle impossible situations when lives depended on making the right decisions. She selected a challenging scenario involving a mechanical failure similar to what Rodriguez had experienced, but with the added complication of hostile territory and deteriorating weather conditions. As her virtual helicopter developed rotor problems over enemy-controlled mountains, Betty applied everything she'd learned about aircraft systems and emergency procedures. The simulated crisis unfolded exactly as she'd expected, because her mechanical knowledge had taught her how helicopters failed, and her virtual flying experience had taught her how to manage those failures. She brought the damaged aircraft home safely, landing at a forward operating base with minimal power and compromised flight controls. But as she shut down the simulator and prepared for sleep, Betty found herself wondering what would happen if a real emergency required skills that went beyond routine mechanical repairs. The pilots at Firebase Scorpion were competent and experienced, but they were also human beings with limitations and blind spots. What if a situation arose that demanded both intimate knowledge of aircraft systems and exceptional flying skills? The question would be answered sooner than she expected, though Betty had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring the kind of emergency that would test every skill she'd secretly developed over the past 4 years. 40 soldiers would need a pilot capable of executing a rescue mission that combined precise flying with deep mechanical understanding. And the only person ready for that challenge would be the mechanic everyone had overlooked, the underground bunker system at Outpost Delta had been carved into the mountainside by Soviet engineers decades earlier, a labyrinth of concrete tunnels and reinforced chambers designed to withstand nuclear bombardment. What the original builders hadn't anticipated was the gradual erosion of support structures by decades of harsh weather, seismic activity, and the relentless expansion and contraction of rock formations in extreme temperature variations. Captain David Morrison had been leading a routine inspection of the facility when the first warning signs appeared. His 40-man engineering unit was documenting structural integrity and cataloging equipment that could be salvaged for current operations when they heard the ominous groaning of stressed concrete echoing through the main corridor. Morrison, a veteran of 3 deployments who understood the difference between normal settling sounds and structural failure, immediately ordered his team to evacuate. They almost made it out in time. The collapse began at the main entrance, Massive concrete slabs pancaking down through multiple levels as support pillars finally surrendered to decades of accumulated stress. Morrison's team was spread throughout the facility, some already moving toward the exit when the rumbling started, others deeper in the complex conducting equipment assessments in chambers that suddenly became tombs. The radio call that reached Firebase Scorpion at 1400 hours carried the kind of controlled desperation that marked truly serious emergencies. Morrison's voice was calm but strained as he described their situation to the base communications center. His words carefully chosen to convey critical information without causing panic among his trapped personnel. Firebase Scorpion, this is Delta Team Leader. We have 40 personnel trapped in an underground facility following structural collapse. Main entrance completely blocked, secondary exits also compromised. We have injured personnel and limited air supply. Request immediate heavy rescue support and medical evacuation capability. The initial response was swift and professional. Firebase Scorpion dispatched 2 Black Hawks loaded with rescue equipment and medical personnel, along with engineering specialists trained in collapsed structure recovery. The flight to Outpost Delta took 30 minutes, time that Morrison's team used to organize themselves and assess their deteriorating situation. The rescue helicopters arrived to find a disaster scene that defied easy solutions. The main entrance to the bunker was buried under tons of concrete and twisted metal that would require days or weeks to clear with conventional excavation equipment. The secondary exits, smaller openings designed for emergency evacuation, were partially blocked and inaccessible to personnel carrying stretchers or medical equipment. Major Williams, the squadron's senior pilot, coordinated the initial rescue assessment while his team searched for alternative access points to the underground facility. The engineering specialists quickly determined that the collapse was still active, with additional sections of the structure continuing to fail as weight redistributed through the damaged support system. We've got a ventilation shaft that's still clear, reported Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, the lead rescue specialist. It's about 4 feet in diameter, drops straight down about 60 feet to the main corridor. But it's too narrow for normal rescue operations, and we can't get stretchers through an opening that size. Williams studied the tactical situation with growing frustration. His team had the equipment and expertise to conduct complex rescue operations, but the physical constraints of the collapsed structure limited their options to scenarios that would take far longer than Morrison's team could survive. The ventilation shaft offered access to the trapped personnel, but extracting injured soldiers through such a narrow opening would be extremely difficult and dangerous. The trapped engineering unit faced multiple cascading problems that worsened with each passing hour. The structural collapse had damaged the facility's ventilation system, reducing air circulation to levels that could not sustain 40 people indefinitely. Morrison estimated they had perhaps 12 hours of breathable air remaining, and that calculation assumed no additional collapses that might further compromise their environment. Medical emergencies were developing among the trapped personnel. Sergeant Kevin Walsh had suffered a severe head injury when falling debris struck him during the initial collapse. Private First Class Jennifer Rodriguez had a suspected broken leg and was showing signs of shock. 3 other soldiers had sustained injuries that required immediate medical attention but were not immediately life-threatening. Morrison's radio communications with the surface rescue team painted a picture of gradual deterioration that everyone understood but nobody wanted to acknowledge directly. The trapped soldiers were consuming their limited air supply while their medical situations became more critical with each passing hour. Conventional rescue techniques would take days to implement, time that Morrison's team simply didn't have. The tactical briefing that evening at Firebase Scorpion brought together every available specialist who might contribute to solving the rescue problem. Williams had assembled engineers, medical personnel, logistics specialists, and aircrew representatives to brainstorm alternatives to the obvious approaches that everyone knew wouldn't work quickly enough. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base commander, listened to each presentation with the focused attention of someone who understood that 40 soldiers' lives depended on finding an unconventional solution to an impossible problem. The engineering assessment was clear. Clearing the main entrance would require heavy equipment that wasn't available in time that the trapped personnel didn't have. What about lowering rescue personnel through the ventilation shaft? Suggested Captain Rodriguez, who had been studying architectural drawings of the facility. Small teams could provide medical assistance and help organize evacuation through the same route. The rescue specialists had already considered and rejected that approach. The shaft was too narrow for personnel wearing full rescue equipment, and the vertical drop made it extremely dangerous for anyone attempting to rappel down. Even if rescuers could reach the trapped soldiers, extracting injured personnel through the same route would be nearly impossible. Lieutenant Chun proposed using explosive charges to create new access points through the mountainside, but the engineering assessment indicated that additional explosions might trigger more collapses within the already unstable structure. The risk of killing the people they were trying to save made that option unacceptable. The medical personnel painted an increasingly grim picture of what was happening inside the collapsed facility. Without proper ventilation, carbon dioxide levels would gradually rise while oxygen concentrations decreased. The injured soldiers needed immediate surgical intervention that couldn't be provided in their current environment. Time was running out faster than anyone wanted to admit. Williams found himself considering options that violated standard operating procedures and common sense. The ventilation shaft offered the only viable access to the trapped personnel, but using it for evacuation would require equipment and techniques that existed more in theory than in practice. Heavy lift helicopters could potentially extract people through vertical shafts, but the precision required for such operations exceeded the capabilities of normal flight crews. "We need to think outside conventional rescue doctrine," Williams told his assembled specialists. "Everything by the book requires time and equipment we don't have. What unconventional approaches might work within our current resource constraints?" The brainstorming session produced increasingly desperate suggestions as the group exhausted standard options and moved into territory that no one had attempted before. Helicopter extraction through the ventilation shaft emerged as the only potentially viable approach, but it would require flying skills that pushed the boundaries of what most pilots considered possible. The technical requirements were staggering. A helicopter would need to maintain a precise hover position directly over the narrow shaft opening while lowering rescue equipment and personnel through 60 feet of confined space. The aircraft would need to hold that position stable enough for injured soldiers to be extracted on stretchers, despite wind conditions and the proximity of surrounding terrain that would create dangerous turbulence. Captain Parker, who had been quietly analyzing the proposal, finally voiced what everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say. This operation would require pilot skills that exceed the qualifications of anyone currently available. We're talking about precision, hovering in challenging conditions while managing complex rescue operations through a confined space. It's theoretically possible, but practically beyond our current capabilities. The room fell silent as the implications of Parker's assessment settled over the assembled personnel. They had identified a potential solution that might work, but they lacked the specialized skills necessary to execute it safely. Attempting the rescue with inadequately qualified personnel might result in additional casualties without saving the trapped soldiers. Colonel Hayes finally broke the silence with the kind of direct statement that military commanders used when facing impossible choices. "We have 12 hours to find a solution that our current personnel can execute, or we start discussing recovery operations instead of rescue operations. I want every possible approach evaluated, regardless of how unconventional it might seem." The Meeting continued past midnight as specialists explored increasingly creative alternatives to conventional rescue techniques. But every proposal eventually foundered on the same fundamental problem. The physical constraints of the situation demanded capabilities that exceeded standard training and equipment. They needed a pilot with the skills to execute precision hovering operations in confined spaces, and such expertise wasn't available among the squadron's current personnel. Or so everyone assumed. In her quarters, Betty Martinez was studying technical drawings of the collapsed facility that had been uploaded to the base computer system for specialist review. Her mechanical knowledge helped her understand the structural engineering involved, while her secret flight training allowed her to visualize the helicopter operations that might be required for successful rescue operations. The scenario was remarkably similar to simulations she had practiced dozens of times, precision hovering over confined landing zones, while managing complex extraction operations. Her virtual experience had taught her the flight techniques required for exactly this type of mission, though she had never imagined she might someday need to apply those skills in real life. As Betty studied the mission parameters, she began to realize that she might be the only person at Firebase Scorpion who was actually qualified to attempt the rescue operation that everyone else considered impossible. Her mechanical expertise would help her manage aircraft systems under extreme stress, while her simulator training had prepared her for the kind of precision flying that the mission would require. The question was whether she could find the courage to step forward and volunteer for a mission that would expose her secret preparation while risking the lives of 40 soldiers on her unproven abilities. Tomorrow would test everything she had learned about flying, fixing, and staying calm when lives depended on making decisions that nobody else was qualified to make. The emergency briefing reconvened at 0600 hours, with no viable solutions and a steadily shrinking window of opportunity. Colonel Hayes had slept for 3 hours and returned to find her specialists still struggling with the same impossible equation. 40 soldiers trapped underground with perhaps 6 hours of breathable air remaining, accessible only through a ventilation shaft that required flying skills beyond the capabilities of her available pilots. Betty had arrived at the briefing room 15 minutes early, carrying a folder of technical specifications and wearing the same expression of quiet competence that she brought to complex mechanical problems. She positioned herself near the back of the room, where mechanics and support personnel typically observed rather than participated. But her attention was focused entirely on the tactical discussions unfolding around the conference table. Major Williams began the session by reviewing the overnight developments, none of which offered hope for the trapped engineering unit. Morrison's radio reports indicated that carbon dioxide levels were rising faster than projected, and Sergeant Walsh's head injury was showing signs of deterioration that suggested brain swelling. The medical window for successful rescue was closing as rapidly as the environmental window. "We've exhausted conventional approaches," Williams announced to the assembled personnel. "The shaft extraction remains our only viable option, but it requires precision flying capabilities that exceed standard pilot training. I need alternatives that work within our current resource limitations." The discussion that followed covered the same ground that had been explored throughout the night. Helicopter manufacturers recommended minimum clearance distances for hovering operations that made the ventilation shaft approach extremely dangerous. Military flight training doctrine emphasized safety margins that were incompatible with the confined space requirements of this particular rescue operation. Lieutenant Chun had been working with the aircraft specifications, trying to identify configurations that might improve hovering stability in confined spaces. "We could reduce aircraft weight by removing unnecessary equipment," she suggested. "Lighter aircraft might be more responsive to control inputs and easier to maintain in precise positions." Captain Rodriguez shook his head at the proposal. "Weight reduction won't solve the fundamental problem. We need a pilot who can maintain Position within inches while managing extraction operations in turbulent air. That's a skill set that takes years to develop under ideal training conditions. Betty felt her pulse quickening as the conversation approached the moment when she would need to make an impossible decision. Everything she had learned during 4 years of secret preparation was relevant to this mission, but revealing that knowledge would require admitting to activities that violated regulations and exceeded her authority as a maintenance specialist. Silence that followed Rodriguez's assessment stretched uncomfortably as everyone in the room confronted the same conclusion they had reached the night before. They could see a path to saving the trapped soldiers, but they lacked the specialized expertise necessary to execute the rescue safely. Colonel Hayes finally voiced what everyone was thinking. Are we certain that none of our current pilots possess the advanced hovering skills required for this operation? I want every possibility explored before we admit that 40 soldiers are going to die because we lack the necessary capabilities. Major Williams consulted the personnel files spread across the conference table. Our most experienced pilots have logged thousands of flight hours, but precision hovering in confined spaces isn't a standard skill set. The closest equivalent would be special operations training, and we don't have any pilots with that background currently assigned to this unit. Betty's hands were trembling slightly as she opened her folder and reviewed the technical calculations she had performed during the night. The aircraft specifications, environmental conditions, and extraction requirements aligned almost perfectly with simulation scenarios she had practiced repeatedly. Her mechanical knowledge provided insights into aircraft performance that most pilots wouldn't possess, while her virtual training had prepared her for exactly this type of challenging mission. Moment of decision arrived faster than she had expected. Colonel Hayes was preparing to discuss recovery operations instead of rescue operations when Betty stood up from her position at the back of the room. The movement attracted attention because support personnel rarely participated in tactical briefings, and everyone turned to see what the quiet mechanic wanted to contribute. "Ma'am," Betty said, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was about to propose, "I believe I can execute the shaft extraction operation." The statement hit the room like a physical blow. Several officers began talking at once, their voices ranging from surprised confusion to immediate dismissal. Major Williams raised his hand for silence while studying Betty with an expression that suggested he was trying to determine whether she understood what she had just said. "Martinez, you're a maintenance specialist," Williams said carefully. "This operation requires advanced pilot training that takes years to develop. We appreciate your willingness to volunteer, but civilian helicopter mechanics don't possess the skills necessary for precision military flying operations." Betty had anticipated this response and was prepared for the challenge to her qualifications. She stepped forward to the conference table and opened her folder, revealing detailed technical analyses and flight planning calculations that demonstrated intimate knowledge of both aircraft capabilities and mission requirements. "Sir, I've been studying this facility's specifications and our aircraft performance parameters," she began, her voice gaining confidence as she moved into territory where her expertise was unquestionable. "The hovering operation requires maintaining position within a 6-inch tolerance while managing vertical distances up to 60 feet. These parameters are within the performance envelope of our Black Hawk aircraft if properly configured and flown." Williams examined the technical documents that Betty had prepared, noting calculations that reflected deep understanding of helicopter aerodynamics and performance limitations. The analysis was more sophisticated than what most pilots would produce, demonstrating knowledge that went far beyond normal maintenance training. Understanding aircraft specifications isn't the same as possessing the flight skills to execute precision operations, Rodriguez pointed out. Hovering accuracy requires thousands of hours of practice and muscle memory that can't be developed through theoretical study. Betty met his challenge directly, knowing that this was the moment when her secret preparation would either validate her confidence or expose her as dangerously overconfident. "Captain, I've been training on flight simulators for 4 years. I've logged over 2,000 hours practicing precision hovering, emergency procedures, and exactly the type of confined space operations that this mission requires." The admission sent another shockwave through the room. Military personnel weren't supposed to have access to sophisticated flight training equipment without authorization, and maintenance specialists certainly weren't expected to be conducting their own pilot education programs during off-duty hours. Colonel Hayes leaned forward, her expression shifting from skepticism to focused attention. "Martinez, are you telling me that you've been secretly training yourself to fly military helicopters? And that you believe this unauthorized training qualifies you to attempt a rescue mission that our certified pilots consider beyond their capabilities?" Betty felt the weight of 40 lives pressing against her consciousness as she formulated her response. The truth about her preparation would probably result in disciplinary action and possible reassignment, but the alternative was watching soldiers die while she remained silent about capabilities that might save them. "Yes, ma'am," she replied. "Simply, I've been using commercial flight simulation software to learn helicopter operations. The scenarios include precision hovering, emergency procedures, and confined space operations. I believe my mechanical knowledge combined with simulation training provides the skill set necessary for this mission." The room erupted in arguments as officers debated the implications of Betty's revelation. Some questioned whether simulator training could possibly prepare someone for actual flight operations. Others pointed out that unauthorized training violated multiple regulations regardless of its effectiveness. A few voices suggested that desperate situations might justify unconventional solutions. Captain Parker, who had observed Betty's work for 2 years and recognized her exceptional mechanical abilities, stood up to address the colonel directly. "Ma'am, I've worked with Martinez extensively. Her understanding of aircraft systems exceeds that of most pilots. If she says she's prepared for this mission, I think we should take that assessment seriously." Major Williams remained skeptical of the entire proposal. Simulation training is valuable for understanding procedures, but it can't replicate the physical demands and stress factors of actual flight operations. We'd be risking the lives of rescue personnel as well as the trapped soldiers. Betty had anticipated this objection and was prepared with technical arguments that addressed the specific concerns about simulators versus actual flight experience. "Sir, the primary challenge for this mission is maintaining precise aircraft position while managing extraction operations. Those skills translate directly from simulation to actual flight because they're based on understanding aircraft response to control inputs and environmental factors." She moved to the tactical map displayed on the briefing room wall and began explaining her analysis of the mission requirements. Her presentation demonstrated knowledge of wind patterns, terrain effects, and aircraft performance that impressed even the experienced pilots in the room. More importantly, her confidence suggested genuine expertise rather than dangerous overconfidence. "The ventilation shaft is positioned to minimize wind effects from the surrounding terrain," Betty continued, pointing to specific features on the topographical map. "Aircraft approach from the southwest provides the most stable air conditions, and the confined space actually reduces turbulence once proper hovering position is established." Colonel Hayes found herself facing a decision that would define her command legacy and potentially determine whether 40 soldiers lived or died. Military doctrine emphasized following established procedures and relying on proven capabilities, but exceptional circumstances sometimes demanded exceptional responses. Staff Sergeant Foster, who had been quietly observing the discussion, finally spoke up with the kind of practical assessment that came from decades of military experience. "Ma'am, we've got 40 soldiers dying underground while we debate whether our best available option meets standard qualifications. Sometimes you have to use the tools you have instead of the tools you wish you had. The statement crystallized the fundamental choice facing the rescue operation. They could continue following standard procedures and watch Morrison's team die, or they could take an unprecedented risk on an unconventional solution that might actually work. Betty remained, standing at the front of the room, her technical documents spread across the conference table, waiting for a decision that would either validate 4 years of secret preparation or confirm that some opportunities were too dangerous to attempt regardless of potential capabilities. Silence stretched uncomfortably as Colonel Hayes weighed regulations against results, protocol against the possibility of saving lives through means that no manual had ever contemplated. In 6 hours, Morrison's team would start losing consciousness from carbon dioxide poisoning, and recovery operations would replace rescue operations in the mission planning. The colonel's decision would determine whether Benchwarmer Betty remained a mechanic who dreamed of flying, or became the pilot who proved that sometimes the most unlikely person in the room possessed exactly the capabilities that impossible situations demanded. Colonel Hayes stared at the tactical map for 30 seconds that felt like an eternity, her weathered face reflecting the weight of a decision that would either save 40 lives or potentially cost more. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. Morrison's team had perhaps 5 hours of breathable air remaining. Conventional rescue operations would take days to implement, and the only viable alternative was trusting a mechanic's claim. That simulation training had prepared her for the most challenging flying mission anyone could imagine. "Martinez," the colonel said finally, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had made countless life-or-death decisions throughout her career. "If I authorize this operation, you understand that you'll be responsible for the lives of everyone involved, the trapped soldiers, the rescue personnel, and anyone else who gets pulled into this mission if something goes wrong." Betty felt the enormous responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical weight, but her voice remained steady as she responded, "Yes, ma'am. I understand the stakes, and I believe I can execute this mission successfully." Hayes turned to Major Williams with the kind of direct look that indicated a decision had been made despite all rational objections. "Prep the lightest Black Hawk for immediate departure. Remove all non-essential equipment and configure for precision hovering operations. I want our best rescue specialists and medical personnel ready for deployment within 1 hour." The order triggered immediate activity throughout the briefing room as personnel rushed to implement a mission plan that violated virtually every standard operating procedure in military aviation. Williams began coordinating aircraft preparation, while other officers organized rescue equipment and medical supplies for the unprecedented extraction operation. Betty found herself surrounded by specialists who were simultaneously preparing for her success and her potential failure. Flight surgeons briefed her on the medical conditions of the trapped soldiers, while rescue technicians explained the equipment that would be lowered through the ventilation shaft. Each conversation reinforced the complexity of what she was attempting and the consequences of making mistakes. Lieutenant Chun approached her with flight gear that had been hastily modified to fit her smaller frame. "The helmet and survival suit are the best we could do on short notice," Chun explained while helping Betty adjust straps and connections. "Radio protocols are set to emergency frequency 7. You'll have direct communication with rescue control and the trapped personnel." The weight of the flight equipment felt strange after 4 years of working in maintenance coveralls, but Betty forced herself to focus on the familiar aspects of preparing for flight operations. Her simulator training had included detailed practice with communications protocols and emergency procedures, knowledge that now felt more valuable than she had ever imagined. Captain Rodriguez appeared with a comprehensive briefing package covering weather conditions, terrain features, and aircraft performance specifications for the modified Black Hawk. His earlier skepticism had been replaced by professional focus on mission success. though Betty could see lingering doubt in his expression as he reviewed critical information. "Wind conditions are marginal but acceptable," Rodriguez explained while pointing to meteorological data. "Gusts up to 15 knots from the southwest, but the terrain should provide some wind shadow over the target area. Visibility is good, which will help with precision positioning." Betty studied the information with the same systematic attention she brought to complex mechanical problems, noting details that would affect aircraft handling and mission execution. Her simulator training had taught her to analyze environmental factors methodically, and the current conditions fell within parameters she had practiced extensively. The modified Black Hawk waited on the flight line like a mechanical predator stripped down for maximum performance. Ground crews had removed seats, armor plating, and auxiliary equipment to reduce weight and improve hovering characteristics. The aircraft looked oddly naked without its usual military configuration, but Betty could see the logic behind each modification. Staff Sergeant Foster supervised the final equipment checks with the methodical thoroughness that had kept aircraft operational through decades of military service. He caught Betty's attention as she approached the helicopter and gestured for her to join him near the tail rotor assembly. "Martinez," he said quietly, his gruff voice carrying an emotion that might have been paternal concern. "I've been watching. You work for 4 years, and I know you understand these machines better than most people understand their own cars. But flying is different from fixing, and lives depend on decisions you'll make in the next few hours." Betty met his gaze directly, seeing the genuine concern of someone who had watched too many young soldiers attempt missions that exceeded their capabilities. "Sergeant, I know this is crazy by any reasonable standard, but I also know I'm ready for this mission in ways that might not be obvious to everyone else." Foster nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that he was seeing something in her face that satisfied whatever assessment he was conducting. "Then go bring those boys home and prove that sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the person who can get the job done." The rescue team consisted of 3 specialists who would rappel through the ventilation shaft to assist with medical treatment and extraction operations. Sergeant First Class Santos led the team with quiet competence that came from years of dangerous rescue operations, while 2 medical technicians carried equipment designed for treating trauma injuries in confined spaces. Betty climbed into the pilot's seat of the Black Hawk and began the startup sequence that she had practiced thousands of times in virtual environments. Her hands moved across the control panels with practiced efficiency, checking systems and configuring aircraft parameters for the precision flying that would be required. The actual controls felt remarkably similar to the simulated versions she knew intimately. Major Williams occupied the co-pilot seat, officially serving as mission commander, but privately prepared to take control of the aircraft if Betty's simulator training proved inadequate for actual flight operations. His presence added pressure to an already stressful situation, but it also provided backup capability if the mission began to exceed her abilities. "Pre-flight checklist complete," Betty announced, her voice transmitted to rescue control through the communication system that would coordinate all aspects of the extraction operation. "Engines are stable, flight controls are responsive, and aircraft weight is within optimal parameters for precision hovering operations." The takeoff from Firebase Scorpion felt surreal as Betty lifted the Black Hawk into the morning air for her first time piloting an actual helicopter. The aircraft responded to her control inputs exactly as the simulator had predicted, but the sensory experience of real flight, the vibration of rotors, the sound of engines, the feeling of lifting into 3-dimensional space, created an intensity that no virtual environment could replicate. Williams monitored her performance during the 30-minute flight to Outpost Delta, noting control inputs and aircraft handling that demonstrated competence beyond what he had expected from someone without formal flight training. Betty's simulator experience was clearly translating into actual flying skills. Though the real test would come when she attempted precision hovering over the target area. The collapsed bunker facility appeared below them as a scene of devastation that reinforced the urgency of their mission. Concrete slabs and twisted metal covered what had once been the main entrance, while rescue equipment and personnel surrounded the area in organized chaos. The ventilation shaft was visible as a dark circle in the rocky terrain, positioned exactly where Betty's mission planning had indicated. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio as the Black Hawk approached the target area. "Rescue 1, this is Delta Team Leader. We've got 2 personnel who are unconscious and several others showing signs of oxygen deprivation. Carbon dioxide levels are approaching dangerous concentrations, and we need immediate extraction. Betty, acknowledge the transmission while maneuvering the aircraft into position over the ventilation shaft." The precision required for the hovering operation exceeded anything she had attempted in simulation, but her mechanical understanding of aircraft systems helped her maintain control as she fought wind, turbulence, and altitude variations. The shaft opening looked impossibly small from the pilot's seat, a narrow target that would require maintaining position within inches while rescue operations took place 60 feet below. Betty's training had prepared her for this moment, but the reality of attempting precision hovering with lives, depending on her performance, created pressure that threatened to overwhelm her concentration. Williams watched her settle the aircraft into a stable hover directly over the shaft. Noting the smooth control inputs and steady aircraft response that indicated genuine flying skill rather than dangerous overconfidence. "Looking good, Martinez," he said quietly. "Hold this position while rescue personnel deploy." Sergeant Santos and his team rappelled through the shaft opening with professional efficiency, their descent disappearing into darkness as they moved to assist the trapped soldiers. Radio communications from inside the facility painted a picture of desperate medical situations that required immediate intervention and rapid extraction. Betty maintained the hovering position with mechanical precision, making constant micro-adjustments to compensate for wind gusts and aircraft drift. Her simulator training had taught her to think of precision hovering as a continuous conversation between pilot and aircraft, with control inputs and system responses, creating a feedback loop that required complete attention and smooth reactions. First Casualty Extraction tested every aspect of Betty's flying skills as rescue personnel below worked to secure Sergeant Walsh to a stretcher that would be lifted through the narrow shaft opening. The process required absolute hovering stability, while medical equipment and personnel moved through confined space that allowed no margin for error. Williams operated the rescue hoist while monitoring Betty's aircraft control, impressed by her ability to maintain position despite the complex operations taking place beneath them. The Black Hawk held steady as a rock while Walsh was lifted through the shaft and loaded into the aircraft's medical bay, his unconscious form a reminder of what would happen to the remaining soldiers if the extraction operation failed. But Betty's real test was just beginning. 39 soldiers remained trapped underground, and each extraction would require the same precision hovering that had already pushed her skills to their absolute limits. The mission would succeed or fail based on her ability to maintain aircraft control for hours, while lives depended on decisions measured in inches and seconds. The radio transmission from Morrison confirmed what everyone already understood. Time was running out faster than anyone wanted to admit, and Betty's untested flying skills would determine whether the rescue operation saved lives or became a tragedy that proved why regulations existed to prevent exactly this type of desperate gamble. The extraction of Private Rodriguez proved that Betty's simulator training had prepared her for challenges that went far beyond basic hovering operations. Rodriguez's broken leg required careful handling during the vertical lift through the shaft, and complications arose when her stretcher became momentarily caught on a protruding piece of concrete 30 feet below the surface. Betty felt the resistance through the aircraft systems as the rescue hoist struggled against the obstruction. In that critical moment, her mechanical knowledge proved as valuable as her flying skills. She understood exactly how much stress the hoist mechanism could handle and knew that forcing the issue might damage equipment that was essential for extracting the remaining soldiers. "Rescue 1, we've got a snag on the stretcher," Santos reported from below. "The patient is secure, but we need aircraft repositioning to clear the obstruction." Betty made a calculated decision that demonstrated both flying skill and mechanical intuition. Instead of maintaining static position, she executed a precise lateral movement that rotated the aircraft slightly while maintaining altitude and shaft alignment. The maneuver cleared the obstruction while keeping the hoist cable properly positioned, allowing Rodriguez's extraction to continue without further complications. Major Williams observed the solution with growing respect for Betty's capabilities. Under pressure, the repositioning maneuver had required simultaneous control of multiple aircraft systems while managing spatial relationships in 3 dimensions, all executed with smooth precision that suggested deep understanding of helicopter flight dynamics. "Nice flying, Martinez," Williams commented as Rodriguez was secured in the medical bay. That repositioning was textbook execution under pressure. Betty acknowledged the compliment while focusing on the next extraction, but internally she was analyzing how the rescue operation was progressing relative to her simulation training. The actual mission was proving more complex than virtual scenarios, with variables and complications that no computer program could fully anticipate. The 3rd casualty presented new challenges when Corporal Jenkins began experiencing panic attacks during his ascent through the confined shaft space. His claustrophobic reaction threatened to compromise the extraction as he struggled against the restraints that were designed to keep him secure during the vertical lift. Morrison's voice carried increasing urgency as he described the situation from below. "Rescue 1, we've got a patient experiencing a severe anxiety reaction. He's fighting the restraints and could injure himself or damage the extraction equipment." Betty maintained a hovering position while rescue personnel worked to calm Jenkins and continue his extraction safely. The delay consumed precious time and highlighted how quickly medical emergencies could compound in the deteriorating environment. Below, carbon dioxide levels were continuing to rise, and several soldiers were showing signs of respiratory distress that would worsen rapidly. The successful extraction of Jenkins required nearly 20 minutes, during which Betty demonstrated the kind of sustained concentration that separated exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. Maintaining precise hovering position for extended periods demanded constant attention to control inputs and environmental factors, with no opportunity for mental breaks or lapses in focus. By the time the 4th soldier was secured in the aircraft's medical bay, Betty had been flying precision hovering operations for over an hour. Physical fatigue was beginning to affect her performance, though her mechanical understanding of aircraft systems helped her recognize and compensate for the subtle changes in her control inputs. Williams had been monitoring fuel consumption and aircraft performance throughout the extraction operation, noting that the modified Black Hawk was performing within acceptable parameters despite the demanding flight profile. But he was also aware that Betty's sustained concentration under pressure exceeded what most pilots could maintain for such extended periods. "How are you holding up, Martinez?" Williams asked during a brief pause between extractions. "We've got 36 soldiers remaining, and this operation could continue for several more hours." Betty checked her instrument readings and assessed her own physical condition with the same systematic approach she brought to mechanical diagnostics. Her arms ached from continuous small control movements, and her concentration required increasing effort to maintain. But her understanding of aircraft systems remained sharp, and her confidence in her abilities was unchanged. "I'm good to continue, sir," she replied. "Aircraft performance is stable, and I'm managing the workload effectively." The simulator training included scenarios that lasted longer than this, so I'm prepared for extended operations. The extraction of the fifth soldier confirmed that Betty had developed capabilities that went beyond what her unofficial training should have provided. When unexpected wind shear created dangerous oscillations in the aircraft's position, she compensated with control inputs that demonstrated intuitive understanding of helicopter aerodynamics under complex conditions. Sergeant Santos observed the aircraft's behavior from his position below and realized that Betty was flying with the kind of natural skill that usually required years of formal training to develop. Her responses to changing conditions were smooth and predictable, creating the stable platform that rescue operations required despite challenging environmental factors. The sixth extraction revealed a new problem when the rescue hoist began showing signs of mechanical stress from repeated use under maximum load conditions. Betty's maintenance expertise allowed her to recognize the symptoms before equipment failure became critical, and she adjusted her flying technique to reduce stress on the hoist mechanism. Williams, I'm seeing bearing wear in the hoist motor. Assembly, Betty reported after analyzing the subtle changes in system performance. We can continue operations, but I recommend reducing lift speed to extend equipment life. Williams was impressed by Betty's ability to monitor aircraft systems while simultaneously executing demanding flight operations. Her mechanical knowledge was providing situational awareness that most pilots wouldn't possess, helping prevent equipment failures that could have compromised the entire rescue mission. The successful completion of the first 6 extractions marked a turning point in the rescue operation. What had begun as a desperate gamble was proving to be a viable solution to an impossible problem, and Betty's performance was exceeding the expectations of everyone who had initially doubted her capabilities. Colonel Hayes arrived at the rescue site as the 7th soldier was being lifted through the shaft, her helicopter landing nearby to observe operations that were unprecedented in military rescue doctrine. She watched Betty's precision hovering through binoculars, noting the steady aircraft position and smooth control inputs that indicated genuine flying expertise. How long has Martinez been maintaining that hovering position? Hayes asked Major Rodriguez, who had been coordinating ground operations throughout the extraction process. Nearly 2 hours of continuous precision flying, Rodriguez replied. She's handling conditions that would challenge our most experienced pilots, and her performance has been consistently excellent throughout the operation. Has studied the rescue operation with the analytical eye of someone who understood both the technical requirements and the human factors involved in complex military missions. Betty's performance was proving that unconventional solutions could succeed when conventional approaches failed, but it was also highlighting how desperately the military needed to recognize and develop exceptional capabilities regardless of their source. The extraction of the 8th soldier encountered the most serious emergency yet, when the rescue cable became tangled in debris inside the shaft, trapping the stretcher 20 feet below the surface. Santos worked frantically to clear the obstruction while the soldier's medical condition deteriorated in the confined space. Betty faced a critical decision that would test her judgment under extreme pressure. She could maintain static position and hope the obstruction cleared quickly, or she could attempt a complex maneuvering sequence that might free the cable but risked damaging the hoist mechanism or losing aircraft control in the confined space. Above the shaft, her simulator training had included scenarios involving tangled rescue cables, and she had practiced the precise control inputs necessary to clear such obstructions without compromising aircraft stability. But executing those maneuvers in real life with a soldier's life hanging in the balance required the kind of confidence that came from absolute mastery of aircraft systems. Betty made her decision and began the delicate process of using aircraft movement to manipulate the rescue cable angle, working the obstruction free through a series of micro-movements that required perfect coordination between flight controls and hoist operations. The technique succeeded after several tense minutes, allowing the extraction to continue without equipment damage. "Outstanding flying, Martinez," came Santos's voice from below. "I don't know how you cleared that tangle, but you probably saved that soldier's life." Williams was beginning to understand that Betty's capabilities extended far beyond what anyone had imagined possible from simulator training combined with mechanical expertise. She was flying with the kind of situational awareness and problem-solving ability that defined truly exceptional pilots. Regardless of how she had acquired those skills, the successful resolution of the cable emergency marked the halfway point. In the rescue operation, with 20 soldiers successfully extracted and 20 more waiting below, Betty had proven that she could handle the routine challenges of precision hovering and the emergency complications that arose during complex rescue operations. But the most difficult part of the mission was still ahead. The remaining soldiers included several with critical injuries that would require extremely careful handling during extraction, and the deteriorating air quality below was creating increasingly urgent medical situations that demanded rapid response. Morrison's radio transmissions were becoming more strained as carbon dioxide levels approached dangerous concentrations. Several soldiers were losing consciousness, and the remaining personnel were showing signs of respiratory distress that indicated time was running out faster than the extraction process could save them. Betty's flying skills would need to improve even further as medical emergencies complicated each extraction and fatigue affected her ability to maintain the precision that had kept the operation successful. The next few hours would determine whether her unprecedented rescue mission saved 40 lives or proved that some challenges exceeded even the most exceptional capabilities. The final phase of the rescue operation began with a medical emergency that pushed Betty's skills to their absolute limits. Sergeant Michael Torres had gone into cardiac arrest 40 feet below the surface while being prepared for extraction, and the rescue team's attempts at resuscitation were failing in the oxygen-depleted environment of the collapsed bunker. "Rescue 1, we need emergency medical evacuation immediately," Santos reported, his voice tight with controlled desperation. "The patient is in cardiac arrest, and we can't stabilize him in current conditions. We need to get him to the surface now, regardless of normal extraction protocols." Betty understood that Torres would die if she couldn't execute the fastest extraction yet attempted, but rushing the process risked equipment failure that could trap him permanently in the shaft. Her mechanical knowledge told her exactly how much stress the hoist system could handle, while her flying experience suggested modifications to the normal procedure that might save critical seconds. "Copy that," Betty replied, her voice steady despite the enormous pressure. Increasing hoist speed to maximum safe parameters and adjusting aircraft position for optimal lift angle. "Prepare for rapid extraction." The decision to push equipment beyond normal operating limits demonstrated the kind of calculated risk-taking that separated exceptional pilots from those who followed procedures without understanding the engineering principles behind them. Betty knew the hoist motor could handle brief periods of overload if she managed the lift carefully, and Torres's life depended on her willingness to make that judgment call. The extraction succeeded, with Torres reaching the surface in half the normal time and medical personnel beginning advanced life support procedures immediately. His pulse returned as oxygen levels improved, and by the time he was secured in the medical bay, his vital signs had stabilized enough to suggest he would survive. Major Williams had watched Betty make split-second decisions that combined technical knowledge with flying skill in ways that exceeded what he thought possible from someone without formal pilot training. Her performance was proving that exceptional capabilities could develop through unconventional means when combined with natural talent and obsessive dedication. "Martinez, that was some of the finest flying I've seen in 20 years of military aviation," Williams said as Torres was stabilized. "You're handling situations that would challenge pilots with thousands of flight hours, and you're making it look routine." Betty accepted the compliment while analyzing the aircraft's performance data to ensure that pushing the hoist system hadn't cause damage that might affect subsequent extractions. Her mechanical expertise allowed her to monitor equipment condition in real time, preventing failures that could have compromised the mission when lives depended on continued operations. The extraction of the 19th soldier revealed how much Betty's understanding of helicopter systems had evolved during the rescue operation. When hydraulic pressure began fluctuating due to sustained high-power operations, she adjusted her flying technique to reduce system stress while maintaining the precision required for safe extraction operations. The hydraulic issue would have grounded most aircraft under normal circumstances, but Betty's intimate knowledge of system redundancies and backup capabilities allowed her to continue flying safely while monitoring the problem carefully. Her ability to distinguish between potentially catastrophic failures and manageable degradation came from years of troubleshooting similar problems in maintenance operations. Corporal Lisa Zhang's extraction became a textbook example of how Betty's combined mechanical and flying expertise produced solutions that neither pure pilots nor pure mechanics could have developed. Zhang had suffered internal injuries that made normal stretcher positioning impossible, requiring a modified extraction technique that Betty improvised based on her understanding of both medical requirements and aircraft capabilities. We need to adjust the lift angle to reduce pressure on the patient's abdomen, the medical technician reported from below. Standard vertical extraction could cause additional internal bleeding. Betty analyzed the geometry involved and realized she could modify the aircraft's position to create an angled lift that would reduce stress on Zhang's injuries. The maneuver required maintaining stable position while tilted slightly off vertical, a challenging flying technique that she executed with the smooth precision that had characterized her performance throughout the operation. The 20th soldier's extraction marked a significant milestone, with half the trapped personnel successfully rescued and medical treatment beginning for injuries that would have been fatal without intervention. But the achievement also highlighted how much work remained and how fatigue was beginning to affect everyone involved in the operation. Betty had been flying precision hovering operations for over 3 hours, a sustained performance that exceeded the endurance limits typically expected from military pilots. Her concentration remained sharp, but the physical demands of continuous, small control movements were creating muscle fatigue that required increasing effort to overcome. Colonel Hayes had observed enough of the operation to understand that Betty's performance represented something unprecedented in military aviation. The combination of technical knowledge, flying skill, and decision-making ability under pressure suggested capabilities that formal training programs should study and attempt to replicate. Rodriguez, Hayes said to the major coordinating ground operations, "I want a complete documentation of Martinez's techniques and procedures. What she's accomplishing here could revolutionize how we approach rescue training and pilot development." The extraction of the 21st soldier encountered the most complex mechanical problem, yet when the primary hoist motor finally succumbed to sustained overload and failed completely, the backup system engaged automatically, but it operated at reduced capacity that would slow subsequent extractions significantly. Betty's response to the equipment failure demonstrated the depth of her mechanical expertise and its value in flight operations. She immediately understood the implications of reduced hoist capacity and began calculating modifications to her flying technique that would compensate for the system's limitations. "Williams' primary hoist is down, but I can work with the backup system," Betty reported while maintaining hovering position. "We'll need to reduce lift loads and extend extraction times, but we can continue operations safely." Her ability to adapt quickly to equipment failures and develop workaround solutions reflected the kind of problem-solving skills that made exceptional mechanics invaluable. But applying those skills while simultaneously executing demanding flying operations required mental agility that few people possessed. The 22nd through 25th extractions proceeded smoothly despite the reduced hoist capacity, with Betty adjusting her technique to accommodate the backup system's limitations. Her performance remained consistent even as fatigue accumulated, suggesting reserves of concentration and physical endurance that impressed everyone observing the operation. Morrison's radio transmissions were becoming increasingly concerned as air quality continued to deteriorate below ground. Several of the remaining soldiers were unconscious, and those still awake were showing signs of severe oxygen deprivation that indicated the rescue window was closing rapidly. Rescue 1, we've got multiple personnel losing consciousness down here, Morrison reported. Carbon dioxide levels are approaching immediately dangerous concentrations. We need to accelerate extraction operations, or we're going to start losing people. Betty understood that the pace of rescue operations was approaching the limits of what the equipment and personnel could sustain, but she also knew that slowing down would mean watching soldiers die from asphyxiation. The situation demanded pushing everyone's capabilities to their absolute maximum, while maintaining the precision that kept operations safe. The extraction of soldiers 26 through 30 tested Betty's ability to maintain performance as fatigue and time pressure created increasingly difficult operating conditions. Each lift required the same precision as the first, but her control inputs were becoming less smooth as muscle fatigue affected fine motor control. Williams recognized the signs of pilot fatigue and began providing more assistance with aircraft systems management, allowing Betty to focus her remaining energy on the flight control inputs that required her unique combination of flying skill and mechanical knowledge. The partnership between experienced military officer and unconventionally trained pilot was producing results that neither could have achieved alone. Sergeant First Class David Kumar's extraction became a race against time when he lost consciousness during the lift and his breathing became dangerously shallow. Medical personnel needed to begin advanced life support immediately, but the confined space of the shaft prevented effective treatment until he reached the surface. Betty executed the fastest extraction yet attempted, pushing both aircraft and equipment to their absolute limits while maintaining the control precision necessary to prevent Kumar from striking the shaft walls during rapid ascent. Her willingness to accept calculated risks to save a life demonstrated the kind of courage that defined exceptional military personnel. The successful completion of the 30th extraction left 10 soldiers remaining below, but these final rescues would be the most challenging yet. The remaining personnel included Morrison himself and several soldiers with critical injuries that would require extremely careful handling during the extraction process. Air quality had deteriorated to the point where the remaining soldiers were all showing signs of severe oxygen deprivation, and several were unconscious or barely responsive. Each minute of delay increased the risk of permanent brain damage or death from carbon dioxide poisoning. Betty's fuel levels were approaching minimum safe reserves, but calculations indicated sufficient capacity to complete the rescue operation if no additional complications arose. The margin for error was disappearing rapidly, and any significant problems during the final extractions could force difficult decisions about prioritizing which lives to save. Morrison insisted on being extracted last, following military tradition that commanders evacuate after their personnel. His leadership during the crisis had kept the trapped soldiers organized and calm despite deteriorating conditions, but his own physical condition was declining as carbon dioxide levels approached lethal concentrations. The extraction of soldiers 31 through 35 proceeded without major complications, though each lift required careful monitoring of increasingly fragile medical conditions. Betty's flying remained precise despite accumulating fatigue, and her mechanical expertise continued to prevent equipment problems that could have compromised the operation. The 36 soldiers' extraction revealed how close the rescue operation had come to complete failure when the backup hoist motor began showing signs of impending failure. Betty recognized the symptoms immediately and adjusted her technique to reduce stress on the remaining equipment. But the margin for additional problems had essentially disappeared. Soldiers 37 and 38 were unconscious during their extractions, their breathing shallow and irregular from prolonged exposure to toxic air. Medical personnel worked frantically to stabilize them as soon as they reached the surface, but their survival would depend on how quickly advanced medical treatment could reverse the effects of carbon dioxide poisoning. The 39th extraction left only Morrison below, but his radio transmissions had become slurred and difficult to understand as oxygen deprivation affected his cognitive function. Santos, who had remained below throughout the operation to coordinate extractions, was also showing signs of severe respiratory distress. Betty prepared for the final 2 extractions, knowing that equipment failures, fuel limitations, and human factors had all reached critical points. The success of the entire rescue operation would be determined by her ability to execute 2 more perfect extractions with systems that were operating at the very edge of their capabilities. Morrison's voice came through the radio one final time, his words barely intelligible but his meaning clear. "Get Santos out first." "That's an order." Even facing unconsciousness from carbon dioxide poisoning, he was following the military tradition of leaders taking care of their people before themselves. The final 2 extractions would test everything Betty had learned about flying, fixing, and staying calm when lives depended on making decisions that no training manual had ever contemplated. In the next 20 minutes, she would either complete the most successful rescue operation in military history, or watch it fail at the very moment when victory seemed within reach. The final extractions unfolded with mechanical precision that would have made her instructors proud if she'd had any. Santos emerged unconscious but breathing, followed by Morrison, whose last conscious act was giving her a thumbs up as he reached the surface. Betty set the Black Hawk down at the medical facility with fuel gauges reading empty and her hands trembling from 4 hours of sustained precision flying. 40 soldiers walked away from what should have been their tomb. Every single one. The investigation that followed lasted 3 weeks. Military officials struggled to document how an unauthorized mechanic had executed the most complex rescue operation in recent history using skills she'd taught herself during midnight simulator sessions. Betty's flight performance data showed precision that exceeded veteran pilot capabilities, achieved through preparation that no regulation had ever anticipated. The disciplinary hearing became a commendation ceremony when Colonel Hayes announced that Betty would receive the Distinguished Flying Cross and immediate enrollment in the military's most advanced pilot training program. Sometimes, Hayes told the assembled officers, the most unlikely person in the room is exactly the person we need. Captain Morrison, fully recovered, spoke at the ceremony. She wasn't Benchwarmer Betty that day. She was the pilot who brought us all home. Today, Major Rebecca Martinez trains new pilots at the same base where she once fixed their helicopters. Her office walls display 40 letters from soldiers whose lives she saved, but the photograph she treasures most shows her climbing out of that Black Hawk after proving that preparation meets opportunity in the most unexpected ways. Her advice to new pilots is simple: never stop learning, never stop practicing, and never let anyone convince you that you don't belong in the game. If this story inspired you, hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from viewers around the world. What's your Benchwarmer story?